that it was fitting that he, from whom and by whom all things exist, in bringing many sons to glory, should make the founder of their salvation perfect through suffering. For he who sanctifies and those who are sanctified all have one source. That is why he is not ashamed to call them brothers. And then he gives some various quotations about that, and that concept is explained some more. But what we have here in verses 10 and 11, as I mentioned, is the goal of the Hebrew writer is, at least partly, is about discussing this bringing many sons to glory. And that's important for them to understand, because in this context, remember when we talked about it, the founder of their salvation, the pioneer, the trailblazer, the first one that went, was made perfect through suffering. And that is going to be the means as well for us to come to glory. And it is because of this reason he is not ashamed to call us brothers. We've shared in his holiness. We've shared in his sanctification. And that's the same ideas that are going to be teased out here regarding, okay, well, why are we suffering? What's the purpose behind this? Where is God during all of this? What's the goal? And it goes back to all these same, all connect to suffering for righteousness' sake and then sharing in his holiness. So those two things are together. So with that being said, that kind of frames what we're going to talk about here. So what jumps out to you here in this section? What words or phrases jump out to you? Yeah, unholy like Esau. And again, I'll add one here. In contrast to verse 10, that we may share in his holiness, right? That's the contrast that is persistent through this. Good. What else? That one's repeated a little bit, isn't it? Discipline, chastisement, lots of that kind of stuff. This is great for a church that has lots of young families. So, what else? Mm-hmm. Yeah, and a lot of that is based in timing. If you look at it at the moment, it doesn't look very good, but it's in the end, there's joy. There's a fruitfulness that comes from that. What else? Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's an exhortation in that. And remember, the reason that I do this at the beginning is so that we're learning to analyze the text ourselves. We're seeing these things, we're able to pull out this information and make conclusions ourselves based off of it. Because it's one thing for me to get up here and, hey, here's what all the text means. But this is your time to go through and say, okay, what's jumping out? What's standing out? And being able to watch the flow of the text. What else? Yeah, for our good. Yeah, that's going to be important. What else? Okay, yeah, illegitimate children, which is going to be, y'all can explain to me what he's referring to and how that happens. Sure. Yeah. Right. Yeah, yeah. Oh, yeah. And there's going to be a lot we'll talk about with that idea. But yeah, usually we think, I'm suffering. I can't be God's child. And he's like, no, you're suffering, and you are God's child because of that. So it's kind of a different way of thinking about it. What else? Yeah. Yeah. Brief and then something, that obviously comes later. And even there, it's been trained by it. So that remember that was one of the flaws back in chapter 5 is that they had not exercised it enough. They hadn't trained themselves in this process. And so he's talking about the goal, obviously, of training. Y'all see the end of this? One thing that I did, I make notes on the text whenever I go through and write, but he lays out at least 6 different things. It's like a bullet list of what God is wanting with the striving for peace. Here's holiness. Here's obtaining the grace of God, root of bitterness. You have all of this list. And so it's kind of easy maybe to kind of lose that, but he has a bulk section, and then he just kind of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Here's some things to keep in mind. What else? What else do you want to identify? Go ahead. Yeah, that is interesting. Um, we'll have to talk about that text. I didn't look at the idea of sexually immoral with him. Who he married. Mm-hmm. Sure. Mm-hmm. Yeah, which is one of those things you might not pick up from the. Do see some of that interaction where the women greatly upset his parents, and then he goes to Ishmael just so that hey, maybe they'll get off my back, sort of thing. Um, yeah. What else? Right. Right. Yep. Yep. And it is interesting because you have one concept in 11 and 12 where something that's painful at the moment but is great later. And then that's flipped where something that's great at the moment and is painful later. And that's the mindset that he's trying to kind of help them to see. Because you see that down in 17. I mean, when he ate the meal, or 16 and 17, hey, I'm sure the meal tasted good. And especially when you're like he was talking about how hungry he was and everything like that. But then afterward, that's when it was bitter. And so you have these kind of just having the bigger perspective of how's this going to be in the long run with these decisions. What else? What else is interesting to you? Yeah, root of bitterness. That's actually at least the idea is connected back to Deuteronomy 29. So that was um, something that Moses has talked about, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well. What else? Go ahead. Hmm. Yeah, you could really interpret a lot of this section through the story of Job, just with all the difficulty and sorrow that he had, but yet what was the outcome of it? How about this quotation? Anybody think the quotation's interesting? Where did he quote from? Yeah, that's one of the lesser quoted sections. I mean, you'll have it on occasion, but it's not very often. And what's unusual about the quotation? Who's speaking in Proverbs 3? Like if you read Proverbs 3, who's speaking? Yeah, it's Solomon. It's just Solomon talking to his son. But yet, when you look at this section, who does he say is speaking? And who is supposed to be the recipient of it? Yeah. The Lord is speaking, and it's not just Solomon to his son. The Lord is speaking to us in that section, and so you have this kind of whole dynamic there. So let's walk through this a little bit. I think we've done a little bit of the interpretation here, but let's walk through some of these concepts. So remember the setting, verse 3 and verse 4, that they are looking to the example of Jesus. He has faced such hostility, and because I can see the hostility that he has faced from sinners, that allows me not to grow weary or faint-hearted. And we talked about the end of chapter 11, about how he is trying to encourage them, and then it's for endurance and courage were the two things that I was emphasizing on Wednesday night. And so now, in their struggle, they haven't resisted to the point of shedding their blood over it. And so it's not to diminish what they've gone through. They've gone through a lot, but it hasn't even been to that point. No one's been killed over this. Maybe no one has gone through and even been beaten over it. And yet there's still a challenge in front of them. So now in verse 5, down through this section here about discipline, as I mentioned, he has the point back there from Proverbs, and going down, that's really down through about verse 11 or so, and then he makes a conclusion based off of it. But when you look at this exhortation here, why does he reference this proverb back from Proverbs chapter 3? What point does that have as it relates to the Hebrew writers and the suffering, or the Hebrew Christians and the suffering they're going through? I can't hear whispers. So, I can hear whispers, but I can't hear them. Right. Yeah. Sure. So don't make them like 3 or 4 sentences long. Also. So, all right, cut that one out. We're going to consider it. So go ahead. Discipline involves not, I think our mind runs. Right. Discipline's, yeah. Discipline is actually training. Word for mm-hmm. The idea being suffering and trial are discipline from the Lord, rather training. Right. Yeah, so you have that same connection. Suffering and trial are about training us. And this goes back to, remember the text that Byron taught us from Romans chapter 5, about how this whole process of how character is built. It's actually through suffering that your hope becomes more secure, and that's this process of character as well. And so suffering brings us character, and character hope is the description there. And it's the same ideas here. But again, oftentimes we run to texts like this and we're suffering, and we either don't know why we're suffering or we don't like that we're suffering. And yet there's this important concept of how we approach our suffering, and the reasons behind it can either be the difference between us walking away from God or being trained and bearing fruit that He. And so we have to be really careful about the way that we have that. And notice that's what a lot of this is about. You look at verse 5, he's got the exhortation of his sons and making sure you don't regard it lightly and you don't become weary. And then he goes through and says, here's the purpose behind it. He is disciplining the one he loves, and he chastises every son whom he receives. So there's this kind of block of 4 different things that happen in the discipline. Go ahead. Right. Right. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, like you said, there's all kinds of things that happen with Israel, and how do we decide them, right? And I think I'll have y'all's comments. I think we'll get the answer. I could give you the answer, but I think y'all will come to it. Go ahead, Jesse. We're in a line now, so. Sure. Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah, so yeah, it's learning from the discipline. One of the things that is interesting is you have this whole concept that suffering is going to happen to every single person. It's always going to happen, but you want to make sure you don't waste that suffering. And that's what happens a lot of times is we'll go through something and we're like, that was really hard, and we don't actually learn the lessons from it, and it becomes a problem. You're in line, so go ahead, Pete. I mean, that is an interesting concept, because in a sense we're all his children, but in another sense, it seems like he's just describing that if you have someone that's an illegitimate child not cared about, I mean, no one's going to go out there and correct them from a parent, fatherly perspective. But what else do y'all think when he's talking about that? Because he goes through, he says, if you are left without discipline, in which all have participated, then you are illegitimate children, not sons. But the idea is that everybody's participated in it. Go ahead, Byron. Mm-hmm. Sure. Right. 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 Yeah, it's something that's woven into the creation that we're supposed to learn from. But that actually is something that the Bible is trying to picture. We look at the consequence that are given to Adam all the way back. Why does he have to work and labor? Why does he die? All of those actually are signposts. We don't look at them, we hate them, we run away from them, but that's the point. They're signposts put in by God so that when we feel that way, we're saying, okay, no, 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 I want something different. This isn't the way it's supposed to be. It's actually a testimony to even people that aren't Christians to say, hey, there's something here. Why do we feel this? We have to explain what's going on. Go ahead, Bill, and then come to Jim. Right. 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 Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, yeah, you grow through the situation. And what's interesting about that is sometimes you go back and ask people about all the hard times and you say, "Hey, would you have it any other way?" And they say, "No, actually. I wouldn't have it any other way because of what I learned through that process." And you wouldn't be who you were if it wasn't for what you had gone through. Go ahead, Jim. Right. Yeah, and well, I remember having a conversation one time with Dan. I was talking, I think, about this text, and he mentioned he had a childhood friend that basically his parents just didn't care. They didn't ever say anything about anything to him. They let him go and do anything, and they would come over. He would come over to Dan's house where it was, I mean, his parents are on him, like, you got to do this, you can't do this, and all that kind of thing. And it was interesting because from Dan's perspective, I'm sure he's thinking, "Wow, I don't like this. I don't like mom in my ear all the time. I don't like all that kind of stuff." But this friend of his was like, "I like that because it shows that they care. It's that he actually craved the discipline." But again, that's so important here regarding perspective. Go ahead. Somebody else had. Oh, there we go. It's the line. No, he learned obedience by the things he suffered, and it's right here in this book. It's Hebrews 5, right? And so that's, again, how are we learning obedience? I mean, a lot of us, I mean, we can learn disobedience really easy. You can just go and do whatever. But how do you get trained into being an obedient child? It's actually through this process of, you can't do that. You've got to do this, and you've got to be corrected. And again, as he points out, there's some really, really important things here. But like down there in verse 11, for the moment, all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant. I mean, the parents don't like it. The kids don't like it. I mean, nobody really likes it in the situation. But later, it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. When you have a good relationship between parents and children and all of that, there's so much that's valuable. But again, we want the fruit, but we don't want to go through the unpleasant part in the first place. Go ahead. Well, I mean, I guess if you put chastisement and punishment for sin, I wouldn't put it in that category. But there are times where obviously he's going through difficulty and pain, but not because he's done something wrong. It's because other people are doing it to him. Go ahead. Mm-hmm. Right. 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 Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, and I mean the thing is, in all discipline, like we understand it, like There's things that you would sacrifice because you want something better later. Like everybody understands that. That's what you're talking about with the school. That's what you're talking about with all of these ideas. But again, what's so important in all of that is actually the mentality. It's the mindset because, uh, like notice again these timestamps. Verse 10, for they disciplined us for a short time. Verse 11, for the moment. Like if you get caught up in the moment of what you need to do right here at this point, and you're losing the greater perspective, it's not going to work. You're going to fail. And in fact, I want us to look a little bit deeper here at the argument of notice what he's saying in contrasting the respect that we have for our parents compared to the one that we should have for God. Notice what he says, verse 9. Besides this, the first argument is God's treating you as sons, and if you didn't have any discipline, you would basically be illegitimate children. But then he brings another argument. Besides this, we have had earthly fathers. Again, this is, I guess, accommodative because not everybody has. But we had earthly fathers who disciplined us, and we respected them. When you look at them in the long run, you are respectful for what they did. And here's the argument even more. Shall we not be much more subject to the Father of spirits that live? Who's your true Father? Your true Father is God, and it's more than just He gave you your body. He gave you your life, your spirit. But then notice verse 10, for they disciplined us for a short time as seemed best to them. I mean, look, anybody that's been a dad for very long realizes they made a ton of mistakes, and they're just trying to figure it out on the fly most of the time. They're trying to get the best information they can and saying, okay, here's the situation. I don't know what to do. Trying to do the best I can in the situation. And yet, here's our omnipotent Father who always disciplines for our good, and it's with the intention of sharing in His holiness. Again, like He's just taking something we would understand with any good parent and saying, now look, God is the perfect parent. And He has the perfect goal in mind. And how much more then should we have this attitude of being willing to accept that and to use it? Go ahead.
I like how we often think about trying to get to a point where I love God more, where I respect Him more. He kind of switches what He says though, because we respect our earthly father called more discipline, but how much more will we be subject?
Mm-hmm.
Kind of switches it there. It's not just respect, but this idea of my will being put in greater subjection to Him and
Right.
His will. And I think that's a big piece of discipline.
Oh, it is.
Need this terrible thing to happen.
No.
Even though I love God and all this, well, part of it is taking my stubborn will and putting it in greater subjection to God.
Right. Yeah. It's about that respect process to bring us to being subjective or subject to Him. But one thing that I've noticed, and this is just being a parent, is that all of this though is an act of faith. It's really, really big because one, you got to, as a parent, you can see and know where we're going, what's the goal, what's the purpose. How often do your children see that that's the goal and this is the best thing to do in the moment? Almost always it's like, what are you doing? Don't do this. And it just seems like, at least for me, it's like, okay, do you trust me? Have I proven my character faithful? Do you believe me that this is the right way? And that's a cultivation of faith, which goes back to what we just talked about. Go ahead, Ed.
Something you said earlier, I think is really important. This is one of those very special spiritual gifts that God gives with the possibility of great gain.
Mm-hmm.
But the whole context shows that it's possible to overlook it or to ignore it.
Right.
To despise it. And so it gives us all spiritual gifts in heavenly places in Christ Jesus. But that's not to say we can't ignore those gifts. This is one of those that can be ignored.
Yeah, and it seems like that's what's going on in the context, right? And what I have is one of the applications. We're kind of jumping a little ahead here, but it's easy to disregard or be weary of discipline. Just think, God doesn't know what He's talking about, or just constantly being corrected over and over and over again. And He's saying, like, be really that kind of mentality. Go ahead. Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah, please don't do that. Yeah. Yeah, but and in fact, actually, one of the things that's in this text that's really important. A lot of times in our modern culture, it's like, hey, don't discipline your kids, don't correct your kids, let them figure it out. It's actually the exact opposite. One of the best gifts that you give your kids is to discipline them and to correct them, and it is an action of love. But don't go the other way, though. It's raising them in the nurture and admonition while they've got to be obedient as well. We're not making a lot of progress, but go ahead, Emily.
Sonship in the ancient times was
Yeah.
very different than what it is today in some aspects. So not only was the son your child and you love them, but also you're the heir. Right?
Oh, yeah.
And so then they own, like they're the ones that next are on your property and all of that stuff. And so you want the son to look like the father, and like physically a lot of times like that happens with like
Right.
spiritually, then like we are supposed to look like our Father.
Right.
Like in many different ways. And so when He disciplines us, that is for our good. And to go back a little further, the example of Israel brought up earlier and how they were not like they didn't know the difference like when the Romans came, like, well, what's happening? And they asked that question a lot, but they should have known because it was there.
Yeah, he wrote it down for them, right? Yeah. He said, when this happens, this will be what the reason is.
And far more like specifically than we do today. Like God specifically said, if you sin against me, I'm going to send you locusts. I'm going to send all these curses
Yeah.
to you because you broke my covenant.
Yeah.
And God has those like signs for us in our day too. You have to look for them. That's important, but also I think all the other points that have been brought up, you have to live your life and learn what you can is also
Sure. Yeah, and kind of to summarize, the sons of God concept is important because you have the Son of God in Hebrews 1, and then the other idea is we are the many sons of God that are being brought to glory. It has to be through the same means to imitate our Father, and so it's being shaped and molded to be like Jesus all the way through the through that concept. Go ahead. What were you going to say?
So this is really difficult for us because we're in a time when anything hard to do,
Right.
and you really only learn through doing hard things.
Mm-hmm.
They talk about this morning in the sermon. Jesus did not call us
Mm-hmm.
called us hard. In fact, do the same hard thing I do. And I think
Sure.
that when we think about Hebrews, yes, we want the Son to learn obedience through faith and suffering. Because he didn't want to do it. Not in the sense of fleshly, didn't want to go through that horrible death.
Sure.
But he learned obedience through it and set a path for us that if we follow the same path, we get the same outcome, which is eternal life. I think when you're raising children, a lot of times you put it to mean, well, I got to slap them around because there's something wrong. No, you may, but what you really need is that day they don't want to do the hard thing, you don't take it away from them. Make them do it because
Right.
they will not learn unless they do it.
Right. Yeah.
And if they don't learn to do that, they will not.
And there's a lot of those kind of things that, I mean, that's the essence really of being an adult, is having to take care of those responsibilities and to do the hard things like you're talking about. Go ahead. Right.
talk about children, their next moment is all they can think about.
Yeah.
And they can't see tomorrow or next that's.
Right.
And when you can't grow up, you see that reality. And or you will never do the hard things. It will never be worth it. It takes too long.
Yeah.
But God wants us to look to our reward, which is a really long way off.
Sure.
And if we can't live with that long-term mentality, then we're stuck in Esau mode, where we're just looking for our next.
Yeah, that's a great point. And that actually, let's move into this section on the application. And really, it's going to go right to what Jesse was saying on this concept of Esau. Because notice, here's all the hard things. He's going through, like, if you have that kind of mentality, then your drooping hands, your weak knees, your feet that need a straight path. He goes on, that what is lame may not be put out of joint, but rather be healed. And I think the idea is that it doesn't get worse, but that it actually is restored back. Again, that's where they are spiritually, and that's where a lot of people are. They get weary, they get tired, they get beat up, they have a lot of hard things. I mean, leadership is just one of those things in general. But yet, he then goes through, and here's the things that are hard, but are also for good. And just think about how these are really simple, but they're also really, really challenging. Strive for peace with everyone. Is it easy to be at peace with everyone? It's not. It's hard, and it's striving, but you have to strive to cultivate relationships. Somebody got hurt. Somebody had a bad opinion. Somebody got upset. It is striving for that. And instead of just, in our culture, the way we deal with that is we just bury everything. That's not what he's saying. You've got to dig into it. Then for holiness, we've kind of talked about that, but holiness is more than just, without sin. It's about the beauty and goodness that is preserved in God's uniqueness and set apart identity. And then here's the grace of God, is that all of these kind of are more positive in the sense of peace and holiness and obtaining the grace of God, understanding what he's done for you and giving that salvation. But then here's the other concept, this root of bitterness, and then many being defiled, sexual immorality and unholiness, and these ideas. So part of this is about pressing on toward the good and beautiful things in life, as well as cutting off the evil and destructive things in life. And when you think about this root of bitterness, this could be, how many times does it have to happen in Scripture, whether it's Achan or whether it's, one of the, Jeroboam. It's one person that causes just an enormous destructive path all the way through that. As he says, many people are defiled. And it just is through things like sexual morality and all of this. But the overall essence of this, again, is the reason someone behaves like Esau is because of the mentality, because of what they want. They're wanting what they want right now, right in front of them. It's my way or the highway. I don't like what you're doing, or whatever the case is. And yet, again, that can't be the mentality. And he brings up an important point here in verse 17. He says, "For you know that afterward, when he desired to inherit the blessing, he was rejected, for he found no chance to repent, though he sought it with tears." Okay, that was the path. That's the way that he went. He eventually knew he really messed up. Was he able to go back on that? It was too late then. And that is so important for the Hebrew writer. It's so important to his point and for the Hebrew audience here to realize, okay, if I give in at this moment and I short sell myself, there's going to be a point where I can't go back now. I can't go back and get what I wanted. I can't inherit the blessing anymore, and I'm going to be rejected because now there's no time for repentance. And again, that's what he's talked about already back in chapter 6, and so we have to be really careful about that as well. All right. I'm not sure who's taking care of the clock, but we're out of time, so we'll stop right there. Thank y'all for the good comments and everything, and then we'll pick up on Wednesday night. We may talk a little bit about that section, but then we're going to try to get through the end of 12. Thank y'all.